engineers and doctors.
Did you say talent? Some of the geniuses who got us to where we are today, we may lose those guys? Okay, I just want to be clear about that.
Mr. Chairman, I would like to make one observation off of this, and that is that if we look at government writ large, there's stuff that government should never do. And then there's stuff that government can do within its authority, constitutional, statutory. There's a big range of government power that we can only deploy if the person who it's operating on has the right to a due process hearing, all the way back to Mrs. Fuentes and her stove in the Supreme Court case of Fuentes versus Chevin. Because we don't have bankruptcy eligible in these areas because of the public utility aspect of all of this, and because we haven't built an alternative judicial or quasi-judicial place to get these determinations made, what we have done as a country is unilaterally disarmed all of the powers of government that bear on these individual property rights, and we right now are incapable, literally, except by persuasion. We can get our colleague Carl Levin to lean on Tim Geithner, to lean on Citigroup, to junk their $50 million French luxury jet that they were buying. But you can't win this battle waiting for one thing at a time to pop up and then leaning on people. We simply don't have the structure now to address what I believe are going to be socially disabling injustices in this system as we stand, and I appreciate the extra time to make that point.
Let me just add, I think it's important, there was reference to the first $350 billion by Senator Graham, and I didn't want to let this hearing go by without saying my own view. If the first $350 billion had not gone out, I believe the financial system would be in collapse today. I believe the Dow would probably be at about 4,000. So while I don't think it was deployed in the most efficacious way, I believe there is no question in my mind, and the testimony before this committee yesterday was very clear on this point. Without that first $350 billion, the financial sector would have collapsed. And I think that needs to be on the record. Senator Merkley.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Several of you alluded to the choice of using appropriated money versus having the Fed finance the additional capitalization of our financial sector. And I want to get a little clearer sense of the advantages and disadvantages of those two approaches, if any of you could comment on that.
Sure. I think that the point, this was we talked about earlier by the chairman in terms of the capital you need for one of these financial transactions. So there's some money. If you have a housing refinance scheme, I think that will be leveraged using access to the Fed in some form. And I think you do the same thing with the approach to the banking system. You have to engage in a level of nominal transactions. The amount of mortgages being refinanced, for example, that is substantially in excess of what you could lose. In any
yes, and I was
situation.
referring to the financial sector. And I assume this was the recapitalization of the banks that was being referred to in terms of additional appropriations versus using the Fed. And I assume by the Fed, we're talking about the Fed lending directly into the banks. But if you want to add any kind of description of how that exactly would work, that'd be helpful.
Yeah, I think you would have the Fed, you would have the government set up an organization like the Resolution Trust Corporation of the 1980s, and the Fed would lend, so it's a government-owned corporation, the Fed would be lending to a government-owned corporation, which is a completely safe loan, and that would provide you with a level of nominal transactionability for this RTC that you would need to in the bank recapitalization and the toxic asset removal. So if you buy the toxic assets at market price, which is what I would strongly advocate in this situation, I think it's completely doable, and the only thing that's fair to the taxpayer, then you should expect to lose money on some and make money on others. The total amount of loss will be far less than the amount of money needed to buy those toxic assets from the financial system. So therefore, it's fair to capitalize this organization at some safe level, so cover the level of losses that you and the CBO think could be incurred, and then use Fed lending to this entity in order to scale up the operations.
Do you picture in that what type of interest rate exists between the Fed and this government entity in that type of situation?
Well, I think that's a very interesting question. Of course, you're just transferring from one branch of government to the other, and you obviously have a say over what the Fed does with its profits ultimately. Anyway, so I think that you would be lending at something close to the rate at which the government the government entity will be able to borrow at a rate close to what the Treasury can borrow at. Essentially, it's a form of Treasury borrowing, but from the Fed in this instance rather than from the public.
Anyone else want to jump in on this?
No, please.
I mean, I'd be interested in Dr. Johnson's reactions to this, since I can take this as an opportunity to learn as well as to pontificate. But, I think the Fed already has extended a very large amount of credit to the financial sector. So you can envision a world where, in effect, and that is being lent to a financial sector that has bad assets on its balance sheets intermingled with some good assets. And we're talking a sum in like the trillions of Fed credit to the financial sector. If the Fed, in effect, shifts from finance...
Can I clarify that? That's really lent at the Fed rate, which has been close to zero. Is that correct?
It would have been lent at a little bit higher rate than that, because it would have been lent against a range of assets. So it wouldn't necessarily be at zero, but at very low rates, yes. And, it would be lending to the government, presumably at a fairly low rate, the RTC entity. But if you can envision a world where, in effect, the government ends up buying the bad assets, and some of the credit that the Fed has extended to the financial sector to support those bad assets now is now extended to this RTC-type entity. And so, in effect, it allows the Fed to exit from its existing bad loans, and so there's not a huge net extension of Fed lending. Now, personally, I would prefer to do it in as clean a way as possible with the least amount of embedded leverage on the government's balance sheet as is possible, so to have more from appropriated funds and less from the Fed, because I think it's just more honest. But I understand the constraints that lead you to, in effect, set up an institution to go out, in this case, and borrow from the Fed.
So in the absence of political issues, you're saying it would be much better policy to have a direct appropriation to fund such an entity?
That would be my view, yes.
Do you share that, Mr. Adams?
Well, Senator, I think there is certainly a limit to how much the Fed can expand its balance sheet without causing concern, both near-term and long-term, as to what the effect is going to be. Are we simply going to inflate our way out of this by printing money? And if we are, that has implications for debt holdings around the world, our ability to issue new debt, and has implications for our currency. So I think it's imperative for the Fed to think about what that limit might look like, although I'm not sure it's knowable until you get there. And then how do we optimize the amount of room left, given all the other missions that the Fed has decided they're going to take on, and some of it articulated in their Fed minutes just 2 days ago. So you could use some of this appropriated money and to cover the credit risk, the cost of credit defaults, because the Fed can't take credit risk, and allow the Fed to use its balance sheet to leverage up. It is one way of doing it. The other is the way Dr. Setzer noted, which is a full front-on appropriation. It's just a function of how much you think the world is going to tolerate an expanded Fed balance sheet.
Well, and in that context, a number of years ago, Warren Buffett announced that he was moving a lot of his assets into foreign currency because of the anticipation of potential run on the dollar. And right now, the dollar is stronger in part because the rest of the world is ailing along with us. But is there a risk here that we are expanding our monetary policy in a way which means when the rest of the world recovers that we might be much closer to such a potential run, countries deciding not to hold the dollar as reserve currency, or is this a risk that you feel is pretty remote? And maybe just real short answers, because I want to slip in one more question before my time runs out, if I can.
I would start to worry much more about that risk when the current account deficit starts to expand. Right now, I think the current account deficit is coming down, but should the current account deficit expand, resume its expansion as it was before, not contract, and the Fed be rapidly expanding its balance sheet and interest rates in the U.S. be very low, that would be a set of circumstances where I would start to worry.
Senator, we should comport ourselves in a way to minimize the potential downside to our currency, both short-term and long-term.
I think the dollar is heading towards a depreciation for the reasons you're alluding to, and I'm not as worried about it as I think you are.
Okay, I wanted to, and Mr. Johnson, I wanted to direct this to you because you're concerned about the 4%. I once read a study that analyzed the 4% loans to veterans coming back from World War II and said it was probably the most cost-effective investment this government ever made for a host of reasons, because of the fact that it stabilized families, created a financial foundation from which those families succeeded. Those families then proceeded to spend a lot of money repairing their houses, so on and so forth. So there is kind of a precedent for the government getting involved in lending or setting a price on lending. So I wanted perhaps if you could expand. Now here I'm thinking about the fact we're talking about the Fed lending I think may come into the trillions directly into the financial world, and maybe something less than $1 trillion through a government entity. Why not have the Fed investing and lending directly to homeowners and stabilizing those homeowners, having the upside on the demand for products within our economy and so forth? I'm trying to get a little better sense of your concern on this.
Obviously, the U.S. government has been involved in the housing market and affecting the cost of housing for a very long time. The program you mentioned is a good example. Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, of course, are exactly designed with the sort of government backing to keep the costs of borrowing down for people up to a certain level of mortgage. The problem is, I think, with all of these programs is they're very hard to contain and control. Targeting the veterans after World War II, that's clearly a self-limiting group of people, because the veterans come back, that's it, right? The problem would be in 18 months, I think, the economy might be starting to recover. Things, we see green shoots throughout the world economy, and then the program, of course, will be popular because you're putting money in people's pockets. How could you possibly withdraw it at that point? The potential for it to become open-ended, and I have absolutely no problem with the government supporting the economy in various standard and innovative ways right now. But what worries me is if you open the door to a big, never-ending commitment or entitlement, a new kind of entitlement program, then I think that's very, very difficult and very dangerous, and I hope you go there with some trepidation.
Thank you all for your expertise and your insights. My time has expired, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
Senator Conrad had to leave, so I'll be chairing this for a little while. Let me begin. The title of this hearing is The Global Economy: Outlooks, Risks, and Implications for Policy. Before I ask you questions about the financial bailout and the crisis on Wall Street, let me ask your comments on another issue. Compared to many other major industrialized countries, we do a pretty bad job in protecting the needs of ordinary people. Among other things, we have the highest poverty rate among industrialized nations. Certainly 18% of our kids are living in poverty. We have the highest infant mortality rate. We have the largest gap between the very rich and everybody else. The top 0.1% earn more income than the bottom 50%. We are the only nation in the industrialized world not to guarantee health care for all people. Our people work the longest hours of any other people in the world. We surpassed Japan a while ago. There are jobs out there now which provide zero vacation time for people. So in terms of when a major economic crisis comes, somebody loses their job today, they're losing their health care, given the fact that we have done such a poor job in protecting the needs of working families and children, are other countries in some ways better prepared to deal with a severe economic downturn than we are? Dr. Johnson?
Yes, almost all other industrialized countries are better prepared. And it's interesting that we have to go through a discussion of a discretionary stimulus to provide additional forms of support, and I hope that is part of what will end up in the final stimulus package, addressing the kinds of issues you're talking about. In most other countries, that's part of what they call the automatic stabilizers. So that if you take France or Sweden or even the UK, when the economy turns down and people lose their jobs, these additional benefits are available. Now, you can question if they're sufficient. I would not want to give you the impression that poor people get off easily and that this isn't a terrible tragedy throughout the industrialized country. But the countries that have the same sort of problems that we're talking about here are more emerging markets. They're countries at a half or a third of our income level where, people don't even register to be unemployed because there's no benefits that come with that, and they just have to go live with family members or find some sort of survival strategy. So I think you're right to identify this as a substantial problem, particularly if we think this is not a 6-month recession. If it's a V-shape, I think this is the one reason for why the officials are staying on the side of this optimistic view. If it's a V-shape recession, you don't have to worry too much because the jobs will come back. But if it's a U, or if it's something longer lasting, then these are going to be first-order problems that have to be confronted, just as they had to be confronted in the 1930s.
Any other comments on that, Dr. Steffen?
I'll just second what Dr. Johnson said.
Okay. If I apologize for being late, but I have not yet learned how to be in 3 places at the same time. It's legislation we're working on. We haven't. But let me ask you this. My understanding is we have spent $350 billion on the first bailout. We've authorized the expenditure of another $350 billion. I gather all of you are in agreement that more money is going to have to go to the Treasury. I should point out I voted against both of those bailouts for a variety of reasons. And then, as I understand it, the Fed now has already lent out over $2 trillion. Does that sound right? Yeah. And some of you at least were suggesting that the Fed may be asked to lend out or should be in a position to lend out many trillions more. Is that correct? Now, I have a car, an old Saturn, and which I think I paid $12,000 for 5 years ago. And if I go to my mechanic today, and the guy says, well, Bernie, your car is in pretty bad shape. It's going to cost you $10,000 to repair your $12,000 car. I'd say, well, let's junk it. I'm going to get a new car. At what point, how much money do you throw down a rat hole before you say, wait a second, maybe it is a good idea to do something radically different? I think Mr. Merkley was talking about a moment ago of using some of this money to provide low-interest housing loans all over this country. I mean, if we took $3 trillion, you could rebuild America in a very substantial way. Why should we put $3 trillion more into an institution which has been corrupt, dishonest, reckless, immoral? Is that what we have to say to the American people? Dr. Johnson?
Well, I think you're asking a very, very good question, Senator. And I think one way to think about it would be exactly to say, at what point you'd be willing to nationalize the banking system of the United States. I think that would be a totally, and by the way, in many other countries, industrialized countries, that is exactly what they would do at this stage of the game. Now, I happen to think in the United States that wouldn't go very well, but while I share, I think, and have spoken in public very similar sentiments to the ones you're expressing about the incompetence and worse, the greed of Wall Street and the amount of damage it's done to us. I've also worked in a lot of countries around the world where the government has tried to run the banking system and it hasn't gone that well.
Right.
So, we're between the devil and the deep blue sea here. And I think my inclination is we stick with the devil for a little bit longer. We kind of know how he operates, and we think we can get a handle on it. I may be wrong. Perhaps we come back in debt to GDP is 80%, and we're in a terrible global depression. And perhaps at that point we nationalize the banking system. And I say that I was wrong and you were right. I think my inclination, and I think Tim Guyton said this I think yesterday, is we've had a private banking system for a long time in this country. It's kind of worked okay most of the time. We try and stick with it. I'm supportive of that, but it's a risk. There's no question. It might go sadly wrong. Perhaps we should be nationalizing at this point.
Well, I personally don't know what the answer is, but I think your average American is saying that. These are people losing their homes, their jobs, their health care, and they're saying, oh, okay, we'll give these crooks who have caused this crisis trillions of dollars more. That makes a lot of sense. That's a good thing to do. And by the way, of course, in one way or another, we're quite confident they will manage to get personal bonuses and their fancy yachts or whatever they get. Yes, Dr. Johnson.
Sorry, just to be clear, the scheme that I'm proposing for a recapitalized the bank system would involve new owners, and those new owners would almost certainly throw out the guys who got us into this trouble.
Well,
so I think wholesale change of the management of the major banks, to me, would be absolutely essential to moving forward. But I do take your point that still, people may not really understand this and may not really appreciate what we're doing.
Okay, other comments on that?
Well, we've got ourselves into, as you, I think, appropriately described it, Senator, an enormous mess. And I think whenever the political system or the financial system has to sort out who takes losses, it's an ugly process. And they're broadly speaking three groups that can take losses. The people who lent money to the banks, they're creditors, there's depositors, money market funds, international bondholders. We tried that with Lehman, and we made a policy decision afterwards that the consequences of that were so severe that we couldn't go forward with that, which leaves two groups: the equity holders and the taxpayers. The equity holders, I think, should take a very large hit. They've taken a significant hit. They probably should take more. If they sell their assets at a low price, that will happen. And then they're left with only one group left. And I fully support the general sense that the economy that we've had over the past 8 or even longer years hasn't worked as well as it should. We also have this overhang of bad debt that we're going to have to deal with one way or another.
Mr. Adams?
Senator, the American people should be outraged. I'm outraged at what has transpired and the cost of fixing this program. Unfortunately, if we're going to have a vibrant, world-class economy, we need a vibrant, world-class financial sector. And I agree we need to make a whole host of suggested changes to management. We need new leadership. I think we'll get that. We have gotten it. We'll get it up more over time. It is painful to watch the amount of money that we've got to spend in order to make it a vibrant system. I agree. But I think it is a necessary cost to ensure the economic viability of our country.
You know, Dr. Setzer, you used the word, we got into a mess. I don't think that's quite fair. We didn't get into this mess. A relatively small number of people pushed us into this mess. And I think that what we're looking at may well be, you tell me, you know more about this than I do, the most, well, maybe since the Depression anyhow, clearly the most severe financial crisis that we've had. And in truth, and again, please correct me if I'm wrong, this was really created by a pretty small number of people who were not content to make 15 or 20% a year. They had to make 40% a year, not content with earning $100 million. They had to earn $500 million, not content with having $1 billion. They needed $3 billion. You're not talking about millions of people. And I kind of resent sometimes the rhetoric that I hear from all over the place. Well, we created this problem. No, we didn't create this problem, frankly. You didn't, I didn't. A handful of people created through excessive greed and dishonesty, creating, you know, all of these esoteric financial tools which nobody understands. You got trillions of dollars of credit default swaps out there. No one knows what that means. So I guess the concern is, A, how do you hold these people accountable? And then I just have strong doubts about going back to a system which any way resembles the system that we had. And I understand all the reforms that people are talking about. I just not even clear that that's enough. So, and I take, you know, Dr. Johnson's point, you know, the word nationalization to me doesn't frighten me, but I understand that the government doesn't do things particularly well as well. So we have that difficulty of not trusting the people who have got us here, not trusting government to do the right thing, and we've got to figure our way out of that. Dr. Johnson?
I think, Senator, one way to take your totally justifiable anger and channel it, if we're still working within the private bank system, is to think about breaking up the big banks. I actually think, you know, these big global financial supermarkets are the buggy whip of our age, right? I think they're a great idea whose time has long passed, and we should get rid of them. And actually, I would suggest that if you come in, the government comes in with capital, which I think it has to do, and the government comes in with the right to determine who are the new controlling owners, which I think you have to demand, that those actually should have some pretty strong antitrust provisions attached to that. Break up the banks. I think we need a world-class competitive banking system, as Tim Adams said. I don't think they have to be big banks, and they certainly shouldn't be so big they can get us into this much trouble.
Well, thank you for raising that issue. When I opposed the first bailout, and I was on the floor, what I said, if an institution is too big to fail, then an institution is too big to exist. And that I think we have to take a very, very hard look at this. But what is heartbreaking, and I spent 16 years in the House and 2 in the Senate, is I have heard these fierce debates. Some of us wanted to do something to help children get a decent early childhood education. and hours for hours of debate, $50 million, we can't afford to do that, we can't afford. Right now, on the floor of the House, we're talking about a few $billion to provide health care for kids who don't have any health care. Oh, we can't afford to do that. And yet, we're glibly talking about trillions of dollars to do what? Is it going to build any homes? Create any factories? It's to bail out an institution which has fallen apart because of the greed. So if you do all that thing, well, we're back to where we were before. It is heartbreaking. But I think, Dr. Johnson, your point about right now, you suggesting that we should end, right now we should deal with this too big to fail by not allowing institutions to be too big to fail. Is that what you're saying?
That's what I would make a condition. I'm sure the government is going to have to ultimately come in and recapitalize the banking system in some form or other, and I think you should insist on that as a provision of that recapitalization, the breakup of these monsters. I think too big to exist is a very good line. And